very close today. We think the last couple of weeks have been farther back, so I'm all up in your grill. Thanks for coming out on the Wednesday, 28 days till Election Day. No problem, right? I think we're all ready to see how this ends and how this goes. I have learned many things doing this presentation. One of them that I learned this week was scheduling the polling section 28 days out was probably not my smartest move. The pollsters who I invited wanted to come out. All of them wanted to be here, but could not because they are so busy 28 days out. So I spent time this week talking with each of them, gathering insights, asking them questions, trying to anticipate questions you all would be asking and want to know. And hopefully I can impart some of that wisdom and information, at least partially correctly, but we'll see how it goes. We're going to talk all about polling today. Quick show of hands, who in here has been on the receiving end of a poll or been polled, as they say? Almost easier to say who hasn't been. Who has been, well, that's a good question. Who in here still has a home phone? Let me ask that. Okay, who does not have a home phone? Right, yeah. That used to be a big deal for pollsters for a while, but now I get calls on my cell phone. I don't know about you all. We're going to talk through how they sample for that, what that means, how they interpret results. I asked several questions of them that we'll kind of go through today, but one of the things that they consistently wanted me to reinforce is a better understanding of what a poll is and what it really means, right? It is not who is winning right now in a concrete sense, right? It is a snapshot of the election. And Jill Normington of the pollster Normington Pets gave a very good analogy. She said, a poll is like a soup. You put in carrots, you put in stock, you put in beef, whatever you're making in your soup, you put it in. The poll is a ladle out of that soup. Now, hopefully, you've got a smattering of all the tastes, but a carrot may not be included, right? Wow, okay, that's pretty good. I can understand that one. I will probably use that. It'll show up in one of our trainings somewhere. So, but that's what a poll is. It is a simple snapshot of the current state of public opinion. And so what I want to talk about today, and as always, this is supposed to be interactive, so raise your hands, ask questions, is not only how do polls work, but more importantly, how do campaigns figure out what they ask? And when they have results, what do they do with them, right? Why take the poll if you're not going to use it? It's not just for publicity purposes, right? And so I want to explore some of that, talk about some examples. I also do want to put a plug in early for next week. We're going to be talking about state parties. What do they do? How are they relevant now and in the future? We have a couple of great guests coming in, 100% confirmed. Ken Martin is the chairperson of the Minnesota Democratic State Party. In addition to holding that position, he is also a University of Kansas graduate. So he was thrilled to come back. Slightly disappointed there wasn't a basketball game when he was going to be here, but that's all right. We also have the Kansas Democratic Party is going to be represented, and we have invited several individuals from local Republican parties to join us. So hopefully we get a good discussion going up here. But I'm excited about that one and wanted to plug it early. So, polling. There are lots of different kinds of polls. And one of the first questions that I always get asked is, what is a push poll? And why did I receive it? Because normally people, when they get a poll, they hear some questions they don't agree with, or it says some things bad about a candidate they may or may not like, right? And they think that that poll must be a push poll because who else would pay for that information? And generally, those are not push polls, right? The idea of a push poll is not to take that picture we were talking about of the general populace's opinion, actually the voters' opinion, right? The idea of a push poll is to change your mind, to affect your attitude or decision in some way, shape, or form. It's not scientific. It's not random. It is designed to be more of a persuasion technique, and quite frankly, a pretty unethical one that's generally not approved of by most campaigns on either side, right? So push polls are fairly rare. They do exist. They are definitely, I think, more prominent online. I have lots of examples in my trainings that I show, but a vast majority of polls are taken by campaigns for legitimate needs. And there are several different kinds. And the first kind that a campaign will take a look at is a baseline poll. A baseline poll is a pretty longer poll to quite a few people that explores how is the electorate feeling right now. And we're going to use the baseline poll as the comparison, as like our starting point. And as we go through the campaign, we'll do tracking polls. Tracking polls are shorter. They ask fewer questions. But the questions can be compared back to your baseline poll. So one of the questions you may ask in a poll, who are you voting for if the general election were held today, right? Well, it's 52% Republican, 45% Democrat, and 3% undecided. I hope I got those numbers right with quick math in my head. If any of these numbers add up to more than 100, just don't say anything. But if it's 52-45 when you start out and you take your first poll in June or July, and then you do a tracking poll in September, and suddenly it's 47-47, you might have had some movement there, right? And you can track over the course of time. Now, the dilemma in all of this is that a baseline poll to 300 plus people that takes more than 30 minutes to complete costs usually more than 30 grand. Polling can be expensive. The tracking poll is shorter, right? Maybe 10, 12, 15 minutes long. It's still got to have the same number of people, and we're going to talk about that sample size, which is how many people answered the poll. But it's shorter, so you're not paying as long to have someone answer all those questions, but that still can be a $10,000 or $15,000 expense. So you can imagine that polling for many campaigns is simply a luxury they may not be able to afford, or that they have to rely on another entity, like a state party or an interested group, to provide polling for them, right? Now, there's baseline, there's tracking polls, there's push polls. What we have seen as well, one that everyone is familiar with, are exit polls. Anyone in here taken an exit poll? No? Okay, you guys have seen them on the news, right? Exit polls indicate that Hillary Clinton is going to win Florida, right? They can be notoriously unreliable. They are taken of people either as they go in or as they come out of election sites, right? There's a lot of press around exit polls. They're interesting. They're always on the news, especially around election day. Political professionals are always wary of them because they're not quite as accurate. They're not quite as robust. They have gotten much better. But I want to spend today focusing on the kind of polls that campaigns use, which are baseline and tracking. So there are several different ways to do a baseline poll. You can do a live poll, which is what some of you in here have had, which is you answer your phone from a number that you don't recognize, right? Which is pretty rare these days. And there's someone on there saying, "Hi, I'm Kelly from a company you've never heard of. Could I ask you some few questions today about how you're thinking about something," right? They will not tell you the candidate's name. Why not? That might prejudice you, right? The idea behind a good poll, if I'm going to spend $30,000, $20,000, $10,000, heck, if I'm going to spend any money on a campaign, I want something that is accurate. to be accurate, if I'm going to use this as a strategic document to help me achieve my dream of winning election, it needs to have 4 criteria. It needs to be unbiased, scientific, consistent, and random. I'm going to walk through what each of those mean, right? Consistent and random. They do seem to be, right? Yes, yes. Let's start with random. I can't pick who answers the poll, right? If I want to have an accurate poll, the best I can say is I can say I want to have likely voters, or I want to have registered voters. What I can't say is I want women over 50 in this part of my district to take the poll and expect to get an accurate reading of what the race looks like, right? It needs to be random in that the way they pick the phone numbers is through using the voter file or many of the other data sources that we talked about a few weeks ago in here with Jason and John, to dial numbers until they get enough people to answer and give enough answers to be statistically relevant. Has anyone in here been following the New York Times polling? Yeah, okay. So the New York Times is doing this fascinating feature leading up to the election where they're doing live polling, meaning they are conducting a poll in real time and publishing the results in real time. So you can watch these little dots go across the screen of how many phone calls they're making. And every few seconds, you get a little blip, and it's, you know, a red dot if a Republican voter answered, a blue dot if a Democratic voter answered. And they update the state of the race based upon the results. Now, it's absolutely fascinating. It is scary to many of the pollsters, I know, because if you have, 10 people answer the poll at the start, well, that's going to be completely skewed, right? So the randomness refers to who you are asking the questions of. The consistent part is how you ask the questions, okay? So what does that mean? Well, that means if you refer to, let's pick Chris Kobach, right? If you refer to Chris Kobach as Secretary of State Chris Kobach, you need to refer to Chris Kobach in that manner throughout the poll. Because if you change up and suddenly start saying, well, the incumbent conservative Chris Kobach, right? Well, those words have different meanings, right? And now you have skewed the results of that question. Additionally, when I do tracking polls, I need to say Secretary of State Chris Kobach, right? I have to use the language that is consistent so that I can compare apples to apples as best I can. Now, consistency comes in a lot of ways. We're going to walk through the format of a poll, but one of the things that I like to ask in a poll, or that campaigns like to ask in a poll, are I'd like to read to you a series of statements. After each, please tell me if you are more likely, less likely, right? They'll probably give you like 5 different ways to answer whether or not you are more likely, less likely, or to vote for this candidate, right? Well, if I read 6 statements on negatives on my opponent, I need to go through and read 6 negative statements and test 6 negative statements, ideally on myself, right? You don't want to just hammer your opponent in all of this, get all of those negative thoughts in everyone's mind, and then expect to have an unbiased result without giving the counter about yourself, right? Because at that point, you're trending into push poll territory, right? More importantly, you're not going to get an accurate representation of the race. So if I say 3 nice things about me, I should say 3 nice things about my opponent, right? And you want to be as accurate as possible. The good campaigns I've worked on have even tended to be too hard on themselves as opposed to the opponent, so that if anything, you're testing the hardest messages against yourself to find out what works and what doesn't. But before we get too far into that, we said there were two others. There were unbiased and scientific. And unbiased is similar to consistent, right? You don't want to use words that convey some type of judgment, right? You don't want to say notorious tax raiser Nancy Pelosi, right? That skews the poll, right? That is not unbiased language. So you want to avoid that as much as possible. When we talk about being scientific, what that means is it means a lot of things, but the results, for them to be statistically relevant, you need a sample size that matters. Who in here remembers their college statistics course? Awesome. Okay, a few of us do. I say us, pretending to be in that crowd. The more people you ask of questions, the better answer you will, the more accurate answer and representation you will get, right? If there are 10,000 voters in your district, the only way to get a 100% certain answer and result is to ask all 10,000 people the same question. That's also called an election, right? But you can't afford to do that. If you do 400 people, you have a better result than if you do 300. At some point, though, your rate of accuracy, you get diminishing returns here, right? If you ask 500 people, you have, like a 3.5% margin of error. If you ask 1,000 people, you have a 3% margin of error, but you've doubled your cost, right? This is why most polls will be somewhere between 300 to 500 people. They've got a margin of error of somewhere between 3.5% to 5%. Now, let's talk about what margin of error means, right? If someone says this race is 51-49 and the polling had a had a margin of error of 5%, well, that means that that race could be anywhere from 56-43 to the other way around, right? It could almost be 54-46, right? Look at that quick math in my head. But what they're really saying is that there's a 95% certainty that the race is somewhere in that range. 95% of the time, this is how the vote will turn out based upon these questions that we've asked, assuming that we have been consistent, unbiased, and random, because there are lots of ways to screw up a poll, right? And if you're using this poll to determine who you're talking to, what you're saying, and how you're saying it, if there's a problem with that, you've got a real problem with the foundation of how you're making decisions, right? If the polling comes back and says women over 50 are majority undecideds, but they respond really well to your education message, you should talk to them. And so you go raise your money and you build a program that talks to women over 50 about education. But you know what? Women over 50 don't care about education. What they really care about is healthcare. You got a problem, right? You spend a lot of money, a lot of time, two of our most precious resources, talking about something that is not the most effective message to convert the people you need to vote for you. That's why this stuff is so important. So the ways you can collect this, there's live polls. That's someone on the other end of the line talking to you. You notice that they have a very, I always found this odd. I didn't know there was a Midwest accent, but I'm from the Midwest, right? But they have a Midwest accent. And even if you're, out east or in the South, the people who call have a Midwest accent because it's neutral. Well, it's the same thing with the newscasters, right? They have to read the question the same way every time. If you try to get them to banter back and forth, they're friendly, but they can't really talk. They can't have a conversation because that can skew the results. It's not that they don't like you. You're all very nice people, right? But they're doing their job to be as scientific and consistent as possible. Now, the other is the automated poll. right? Where a recorded voice says, you know, are you voting for Chris Kobach? Press 1. Are you voting for Laura Kelly? Press 2. I went into movie phone voice there for some reason. I have no idea why. But those automated polls are much cheaper. You don't have any labor cost with those because there are companies whose sole job is to be call centers that do this type of polling. They don't care what they're asking about. A pollster comes to them and says, I need you to do a 500-person survey on this date to this date, right? And it usually takes 2 or 3 days to do a poll on a campaign because you have to call so many people to get enough answers. And there are companies that provide these services. They do a lot of other things. You can imagine all the other businesses, revenue streams that call centers may have, right? But they engage that call center to make all the calls necessary. There's automated, but there's also online polls. Who in here has taken an online poll? Anyone? 1, 2, a few? Okay. Most of the online polls that I have seen, there's a lot of debate within the industry of how accurate are they, right? And there are some new groups on both sides pioneering some amazing new techniques that are still being proven out. Right? On the Democratic side, there's one called change research, which has shown some pretty good results so far. But until we have a larger sample size of their polls, we won't know. One of the things that has been interesting to see, does anyone in here know Nate Silver? Not like personally, right? But 538, it's now part of the New York Times, has aggregates and rates all of the pollsters based on their methodology, based upon how they report results and how likely those are within the margin of error of the actual results, right? And it's fascinating to see that. It's also fascinating, this is a tangent, but it's also fascinating how that affects businesses within the consulting industry, right? Because I've had new candidates ask me, like, do you have a pollster you recommend? And I say, well, yeah, I have a few. And they're like, well, what does Nate Silver say about it? Holy cow. Nate Silver suddenly became the Yelp of Democratic pollsters, I guess. I don't know if that was intended or not, you know? People start leaving ratings, like 4 stars, but, okay. So we have the different types of polls. We have the different ways we can answer polls. We have the margin of error in understanding what they can tell us. Let's walk through how you go about creating a poll, a baseline poll for the first time. And I'm just going to use myself in a fictional example to kind of figure this out and make it a little more relevant. So the first step with any poll is research. And opposition and self-research is one of those areas that most campaigns don't think about too much, but is very relevant. I want to know everything about me and my opponent that is known possibly to the public. Now, this is not some type of, I have friends and my wife who were very into Scandal and other shows on TV. That's not reality, right? Opposition research is going through and looking at every publicly available document on your opponent. Do they have a voting record? Wonderful. Get a copy of every vote they've ever cast, right? What are their public tax documents? What are their current business licenses, right? Everything that's available out there publicly. You're not going through their trash. You're not following them around with a secret camera trying to do something. What we're looking for, and then, by the way, do the same thing on yourself or your candidate, right? Because what you want to know is what are all the available messages to me that I can use to convince voters to vote for me or against my opponent, right? And I want to get them all laid out. I want a complete as possible list. And then I want to start to develop and think through, well, what are the messages that I want to test out in my poll? Because a poll at 30 minutes, man, even thinking about taking a 30-minute poll, and I'm a geek on these things, and I'm like, I don't have 30 minutes to do this, right? And I also don't want to spend that much money on my campaign for 30 minutes. I can't test everything I want to test. I can probably test 3, 4 real messages in my poll. So I got to figure out what are the 3 or 4 best messages I want to test. Is it taxes? Is it healthcare? Is it something messy, personal that we can substantiate, right? But then I also want to know what's my opponent going to hit me with, right? Is it the fact that I've never held public office, that I've been a political hack since I graduated, right? Like, what are the things that they can attack me on? Did I vote for a tax increase? Did I vote to close a school? Because I want to know how effective is that argument against me. So I need to lay out all of these things that I want to test, but then I have to figure out how do I phrase them, right? Because we talked about being consistent and being scientific. How do I, and now I'm blanking on the term for this, but there is, every question I ask affects the outcome of subsequent questions, right? So if I go about calling Nancy Pelosi a liberal, tax-loving Democrat, right, that affects every subsequent question. If I ask about taxes in a very generic way, that still has my respondent in a certain frame of mind. It's going to affect every question thereafter. So I need to make certain I don't ask any question before I absolutely have to, so as not to prejudice additional information, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out the screen for my call, for my poll. And by the screen is, who do I want to answer, right? Are you 18 years of age or older? Are you a registered voter, right? Those are 2 very generic screens that almost everyone has. But then I need to figure out, what type of voter do I want? Are you likely to vote? Are you just a registered voter? Because those are 2 different universes, right? There are a lot of registered voters who do not turn out on election day, much to the consternation of campaigns on both sides. But I need to figure out which one of those do I want. And those are the first questions in any poll that you all get, right? Are you over 18? Are you registered to vote? And how likely are you to vote? And then from there, they can determine whether or not they'll continue. And at any point that you don't answer a question that fits the screen, the call ends. Thank you so much, appreciate your time, and boom, they move on. Now, the actual process of how this works, by the way, has anyone in here worked in a call center? Got one? Okay. So it's not someone just punching numbers in all day long, right? There are auto dialers going on. So quite literally, the person on the other end is sitting in front of a computer with the script in front of them, and it walks them through what to do. They can enter the data in real time, and the moment that it terminates the call, the computer is already dialing hundreds, if not thousands of other numbers, so that this person isn't stuck waiting while the phone rings, right? The moment that call ends, there's usually a pause, some kind of silence on the microphone that they've got a little headset just like this, and then a new person pops up on their screen, and boom, they're right there. There's no ringing. It's a little disconcerting at first because you're suddenly just talking to a new person, right? Oh, Mr. Dietrich, thank you so much for answering my call. I'm so-and-so with a company you've never heard of. Do you have 45 minutes to give me your opinions on this very important political topic, right? That's what's happening on the other end of the line. They're not connected to the campaign. They're entering the information you give them into the computer. All right, so we have our screen. Well, because every question I ask affects every question thereafter, I've got to set my base, right? I got to determine where are we to start things so that I can figure out at the end, how did things change? So the first questions you usually get is something like, I'm going to read a list of elected officials in your area. I'd like you to tell me on a scale of 1 to 5, do you know this person? Do you like this person, right? These are the questions: job approval, recognition, name recognition, important things, right? Name recognition is simply how many people know that individual. And as you can imagine, when you ask the questions, they start generally at the top. President Donald Trump has pretty high name recognition, right? But as you go down, you suddenly do senators, governors, doing pretty good, right? You're probably still in the 90s, maybe the 80s. You start getting to state rep, you're getting a lot lower, right? A very interesting thing, and this I love this this little anecdote from when I started on campaigns and loved it. When you do a poll, the initial poll in a challenger race for someone who's never run for office before, right? And you ask people, do you know or are you familiar with? Question. There is a certain number of people who do not want to answer they don't know someone. So you could conduct a poll in the 3rd District of Kansas here, probably today, asking, do you know so-and-so? Sharice Davis, do you know, forgive me, thank you, Kevin Yoder. Do you know Kelly Dietrich? I will get affirmatives. And they are not friends of mine answering the poll. It's that people don't want to admit they don't know something. This is one of the ways that polls can be inaccurate, but there are ways to compensate for that. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But I need to know what my name recognition is, right? Because I want to get my baseline to start. Okay, 12% of the people know Kelly Dietrich in this district. After 2 months of, running television ads and mailing people until they're sick of going to the mailbox, hopefully, when I ask this question again in a tracking poll, that number is much higher. 73% suddenly know who Kelly Dietrich is, right? Now, name recognition isn't always great. It depends on what they think of you, right? So you have to explore that next, right? That's the job approval. And that's a question that usually follows a name recognition. Tell me how you feel about the job that President Donald Trump is doing. Tell me how you feel about how the US Congress is doing. Interestingly, even though Congress's numbers are in the toilet and usually are very low, Congress people, everyone thinks that their area is special, right? My congressman, my congressperson is special. She's great. He's awesome, right? How are things going in the country overall? Oh, they're in the dumpster. Well, how are things in your area? This is great, right? You have that local bias. But you want to get the baseline of those so that you can track over time how opinions change and you can figure out if the messages you're using are being effective, right? Okay, so now we've gone through, we've set our baseline, how many people know me, what do they think about the people in this race? Then we're going to ask some questions like, if the election were held today and the candidates for US Congress were Kelly Dietrich or Kermit the Frog, who would you vote for, right? Dude, don't laugh. Kermit is a formidable opponent. You're going to take that information, and that's going to give you that's going to give you your baseline sample right there, right? That's where we're starting from on the head-to-head. It's called an uninformed head-to-head vote, okay? Hopefully I'm beating Kermit the Frog, but if I'm losing to a puppet, I've got some work to do. From there, we're going to start testing out messages. And this is where those 3 or 4 things that I have picked start to come into play, right? You can start asking questions like, I'm going to read a series of statements. Actually, let me back up. What you'll do next is, what are the issues that matter, right? I don't want to prejudice them yet with messages from my campaign. I want to know if just unprompted, which issues matter most. And because you have to give them some responses, right? So you'll generally pick out half a dozen or so responses, and you'll say something like, I'm going to read to you several different issues currently facing the country. Please tell me which you think are incredibly important, somewhat important, not important, don't know, right? And it'd be like taxes, immigration, healthcare, the canceling of the Muppet Show, right? These type of things. And people will tell you on a scale of 1 to 5 somehow how important those are. And you can use that. There's always a space for other, by the way. You can use that information to gauge what people are thinking about. And what you're going to see generally is that 2 or 3 issues are really high, and then there's a break and there's 2 or 3 issues that aren't as important, right? But really high, you can't get 100% of the people to agree on 100% of things all the time, right? As we all know from being fans of politics over the past 4 years. But you'll see that, oh, taxes are really important. Healthcare is really important. Healthcare may be higher this year than other cycles, right? Immigration was higher in 16 than it is now. These things vary based upon news cycle, current events, all kinds of different factors. That again gives me an unbiased view of what my electorate is thinking about. Then I can test my messages, right? This is all in the same phone call. The question was, is this all in the same phone call? It is all in the same phone call, which is why the baseline poll takes a while. It can be 30 plus minutes. Great question. The question is, what happens if that person hangs up? You don't get to use it. It's not enough. That is you just have to start over, and that person does not count towards your total, unfortunately, because you need to be able to compare all of these things at the end, right? You run through your list of messages. You test them out. You test 4 or 5 positive, right? And then you test the positives on your opponent, 4 or 5, right? You can then do another, if the election were held today, who would you vote for, right? Or you can go straight to the negatives. And then you have to do 3 or 4 negatives, 3 or 4 negatives. And then you can retest the head-to-head, right? Sometimes they'll say, I'd like to read to you a description of the people currently running for Congress. Please tell me how likely you are to vote for each, to who likely you are to vote for, right? And they'll read you a paragraph that says, Kelly Dietrich is a dedicated father and family man living in Chicago, Illinois, who wants to make education the top priority for the city of Chicago, and on and on and on. But his opponents say Kelly has no experience. He's a partisan Democratic hack who puts party above country and XYZ, right? My opponent, Kermit the Frog, is an accomplished incumbent with a history and track record of reducing taxes, promoting equality amongst pigs, but also negatives on him, right? He has a failed TV show that resulted in thousands of Muppets being laid off, right? And, his show was produced in China or something, I don't know. But they have to be balanced. And that's, when you get to that point, you're at the informed head-to-head. So when you see a poll result that comes out that says the informed head-to-head was 42-45, what that means is after they've tested all the messages, right? I've tried to convince you either way. So I rinse and repeat this as often as I need. The messages, the negatives, the arguments for, the arguments against. And then there's one more thing I need to do before I hang up on the phone, and that's I need the demographic information on the respondent, right? And that's usually a series of half a dozen or more questions. That's everything from how old are you? Are you a man? Are you a woman? What is your political affiliation? Household income, religion, ethnicity. There's all kinds of information that you ask for there. And there are some standard questions, and you can make that as robust or as small as you like. The reason we ask for all of that is so that at the end, we have crosstabs, which are the bane of any statistic class existence, but that is how many women over 50 responded to the education message as compared to the tax message, as compared to the healthcare message, right? I can start going through and looking and figuring out, and let's say I have, in my congressional race, I know that on average, 50,000 Democrats vote for the Democrat no matter what. and I know that I need 60,000 votes to win, right? That means I have to find 10,000 votes if I'm going to win on election day. We think that 60,000 votes are going to win this election, 50,000 already coming from Democrats. What I want to look for in there is, okay, what are the messages that move people who identify as independent? Or if I can figure out that, look, in this 10,000 votes, it's Democratic women over 50 who don't turn out regularly that I need to motivate. In my poll, how did Democratic women over 50 respond to certain questions in arguments, right? I can then figure out, okay, I need to be talking about education because that's what moves my persuasion universe. I can take it, if I want to go a step further, depending on how many resources you have, you can start targeting, generally you want to have one message, right? You don't want to be saying different things to different people, but you can target from those results, okay? That defines what I'm saying in my TV ad, who I'm mailing, what I'm saying when I mail them, et cetera, all the way down the line. It's what I'm saying when I knock on doors, right? If I'm targeting women over, Democratic women over 50 who are not reliable base voters, meaning they don't turn out every election, I can find those people in the voter file, right? So now I have a list of the, maybe there's 20,000 women who fit that category. I need 10,000 of these, right? I can focus my time, efforts, and energy there.
When you get to the bottom, the last questions of the baseline poll, where you are finding the demographics of that person, it seems to me like, is there a chance that the randomness could actually end up with you ask too many Democrats compared to Republicans?
Fantastic.
And how do you sort that out?
Fantastic question. So the question is, what if your sample doesn't get enough of one important demographic or another? It's a great question. You keep the poll going and adjust. So as the poll goes forward, right, you're mathematically looking, they know in real time. They can tell, you know what, 60% of our respondents have been men so far. Let's only start dialing the women until we can get. Now, you base that upon the demographics of the voters in the district, right? If your district, and this is a great question, thank you, because I forgot to talk about this. If your district is made up of, I'm just going to use round numbers, it's 25% African American, 25% Latino, 25% Caucasian, and 25% Chinese, right? You need to make certain that your respondents are 25, 25, 25, right? You need the same percentage along the way. If you get too many African American respondents, that's not going to be an accurate picture of the electorate. And so you adapt and change as you go along to make certain you're getting more respondents to fit that. Now, sometimes you can't always do that, right? There's no way that you can get enough people in every category. You can't get enough women over 50 who live in this area, in this, income range, et cetera, et cetera. So what you can start doing there is extrapolating the results using weighting. And that means I don't have 300 respondents who fit this particular category. I only have 112. So I am giving their answers more weight when I think about this category's, these people's responses, right? Does that make sense?
Sort of related to this, is anyone doing research on who, on what type of person keeps their landline?
Yes.
Because I got hit yesterday for about the third round from the same poll. And I was thinking about that as I was answering, because I thought, okay, I have the time to kill to answer this.
Right.
And I'm having fun picking my answers this time around, And and it wasn't a particularly good poll because the options, there were a total of 10 interest areas that I could have, and I thought, this is absurd.
Yeah,
They
I
had
need
to go to
take
the
notes.
they had to go to the pound sign for you to
Oh.
but it didn't. Yeah, I thought, okay, this is not good. But you know, I was thinking about that sort of thing. I mean, it's the Dewey Truman thing that that keeps dogging me. Is like, okay, I'm having fun answering this, but this is because I like to answer these things.
Right.
You know.
So the answer to the question is yes. There's a lot of research going into who has landlines, who doesn't, who has cell phones, who answers these things, right? I mean, part of...
How do you keep from getting lonely people to do the base? I got time.
Yeah, right? So for those of you online, it was how do you stop lonely people from only answering? This is let me just jump to that right now, which are ways that polls can be wrong, right? And look, it's polling. It's got a bit of randomness to it. So every now and then you'll get an outlier poll. It's statistically going to happen occasionally that a poll is just, you know, they called a random sample of people, and that random sample did not reflect the overall electorate. It happens, but not near as much as anyone thinks, right? I mean, if you have a 95% certainty that it's within this range and it is outside of that range, well, 5%, that's 1 in 20, right? I mean, that's not that much, but it's not that often either. And there are things you can do to make certain you're more accurate. But there are other ways it can be off. One is by the respondents. If a certain group of people choose not to answer or participate, they are not going to be included, right? I have not seen the research yet, but I know there is a lot of talk about in 2016, were Trump supporters just not admitting or taking polls, right? Now, most of the pollsters I've spoke with have said, listen, the polls weren't wrong at the end. Some of them were off, but they were all within the margin of error. The margin of error was close enough that you just didn't like the result you got, but it was within the 95% certainty of the poll, right? Losing Wisconsin was not anything, I don't think, that the Clinton team anticipated, but their polling, when you're up 3-4 points in Wisconsin, that's within the margin of error. It's entirely possible that you are losing Wisconsin, right? So all of these polls, I was looking, Real Clear Politics is a website that kind of publishes a lot of the latest polls, and I'm looking through, in most of, you know, many of the contested races, including here in Kansas, are all within the margin of error. And look, my own bias, if I see a Democrat's up 2 or 3 points, I'm like, yeah, we're winning. But we're not, right? We don't know. We know that, you know, we might be winning by 7 or losing by 3. That's what we know. It's a good place to be, don't get me wrong. I'd rather be there than have a poll come back down 4, right? But even down 4 is not a reason to be disheartened. Down 4 means, listen, we could be within that range, right? That is up for grabs.
When would you consider a safe state, or a state safe then? Like, if you're out of the margin of error, if you're above that, like, is there any way to know?
Sure. Especially after 2016, I'm not certain anyone would call it safe. No candidate ever thinks they're safe because, you know, look, it's their career, their election on the line. Generally, if you are consistently above, 50%, but if you're above 55, 56%, you're doing really well, right? But again, you want to see a series of polls over time and not just one. And I don't think anyone would ever consider certain states safe because they are always within the margin of error. Now, some states, like, look, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma are Republican red in presidential years, right? And I don't think that the Republicans would ever say they're not safe states. Texas and Georgia used to be in that category. Democrats could argue in 2020 they may be in play, right? So it all depends is the short answer. In congressional races, you're seeing the RNC and Congressional Leadership Fund pull out of races where they're trying to defend Republican incumbents because so many polls have come back outside the margin of error that show their candidates losing because of the enthusiasm amongst the Democratic base this year. So it's kind of hard to make that determination, but if you're consistently polling that high, you're doing well. A lot of what people will be focusing on, at this point in many races, the Democrats and Republicans have made up their minds, right? You're looking at independents and undecideds. You're looking at how do I turn out my base? How do I turn out people who don't vote that often? And this is a debate that has gone on as long as I've been in politics, which is, should Democrats focus on getting independents to vote for them and converting moderate Republicans, or do Democrats focus on turning out the base and getting more Democrats to vote? If I had the answer to that, I'd be who knows? I'd be a lot better Democratic strategist than I am. But we were talking about the different ways polls can be wrong. So non-random, we talked about that. If you've already decided who you're polling, that doesn't give you a clear snapshot. Bad methodology, right? If you start asking, remember, every question affects subsequent questions. If you start testing messages and saying negative things about your opponent and everything nice about you, and then you ask for an informed head-to-head, that's skewed, right? That doesn't work. Those are ways that it can be off. Non-response bias. That's what happens when a certain group of people don't answer, right? Trump supporters in 2016, did they not answer? Were they not reflected accurately in the polls? If people don't have landlines and you're only calling landlines, right? That's a dilemma. That's a real dilemma. And then researcher bias, right? Are you making presumptions and assumptions about the data, about these crosstabs, because of the way you think and not what the data tells you? And the very best pollsters on both sides are, look, they're some of my best friends, and they're also some of the most infuriating people you ever meet, right? Because they're so dispassionate about things. And in politics, we get passionate about things. And you'll say things like, well, we should have Medicare for all. I mean, everyone in the country would support that. And they'll be like, well, actually, right? And you're like, no, just let me have this one thing. But they're right. You can't let your personal bias affect how you look at data. As much as I want to look at a poll that says, 47-46, we're winning. That's not what that poll says, right? It says we're in a really good place. It also tells me we have 3 points to go before we're above 50, and there's a pretty good chance that we might not be winning right now. But it's neck and neck. And things can change, right? That's a lot of me talking. Thank you for indulging me. Let's open up some questions.
I'm becoming more concerned that polls may be in the process of becoming more of a political tool rather than a measurement. Based on your last comment about research bias, or the bias of the pollers, when I see something that says so-and-so candidate is 8 points above the other, and that's way out of line, that's pretty obvious. But what's to keep somebody from saying, well, we're 4 points, that's within margin of error, but look, we're 4 points ahead. Isn't that great? Because I think a lot of people look at and depend on the polls to make their own determinations.
I think you're exactly right. And lots of campaigns, and even I as a fundraiser on campaigns, if I get a poll that said we're up by 2 or 3 points, you sure as heck better believe I'm emailing around going, we're up by 3 points, we've got 28 days left, let's do this, right? Send more money so we can put more stuff out so that we can grow this lead, right? And it's not inaccurate, but it's not the whole picture of the poll. My counter argument to why it won't be used as a tool is twofold. Number one, a majority of the media now won't just accept things on face value. They want to know who did the poll, can we see the crosstabs, can we see the methodology behind it so that we know this isn't just some push poll you did trying to generate enthusiasm. So that is a good check. The other check is also pure economics, which is me as a pollster, I have to create and produce a product that is effective and works for my clients. And it needs to be brutally honest. If I tell someone they're up by 4 or 5 points and they lose by 8, they're going to come asking a lot of questions, right? And if I'm not viewed as an accurate pollster, I'm not going to get business. Does that make sense?
One of the last things you said was that things change. And you noted at the beginning the unavailability of the pollsters. We've got a hurricane going into Florida where there's a lot of tight races.
Yeah.
How does that affect tracking polls?
So, and this is going to be just spitballing off the top of my head, a lot, and in several different ways, right? One of the things change, meaning like no one saw the Brett Kavanaugh saga coming. We knew that there, you know, in May and June when you're doing baseline polls, right? You may have known the possibility of a nomination, but you had no idea that that whole thing was going to come up and go the route that it did with the FBI investigators, right? How does that change things? You can bet there were lots of polls out there. With the hurricane, it's a whole bunch of things. Number one, early vote starts soon. And I don't know when exactly in Florida and Alabama and Georgia, et cetera, but you're not going out to vote in a hurricane. So if your part of your strategy is about early vote, suddenly you're scrambling to do a lot of different things. No one's answering tracking polls right now down there, right? So you were hoping to get information about your race, and suddenly that's on hold for a week or so, right? And you have to just kind of figure your way out. Now, no campaign should be completely poll dependent. Right? You shouldn't make every decision based upon your poll, right? It is a good touch point. It is a good reference, but it is not like, okay, should I wear the blue tie or the red tie today, right? You've got to be authentic out there. Those are just a few of the ways that the hurricane can wreak havoc. Let's also think about how does the government respond, right? If they do a bang-up job and you've got Rick Scott in there, he might get a bump for doing such a great job, but if it gets all foobarred, right, and people blame him, you have a whole new issue injected into the race, and you've got to figure out, wait, do people care more about this, or should I keep talking about health care? Right? You got to figure that out. And I mean, look, it's called political science, but it's a lot of art. There were more questions, I know.
Yeah, I serve on a board that purchases polls like this, but we also, and I'm a poll skeptic. They just don't turn me on, and I get to read all the crosstabs and everything, and we get into these wonderful debates of what this means. This is a little beyond the scope of this, but I'd like you to talk about, excuse me, where we get a group of people in a room and ask them what they think, because we did a focus group in Wichita, a focus group in Johnson County, and just for your information, we eliminated strong Democrats, strong Republicans.
Okay.
And I found reading that transcript really informative and helpful for us in planning strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. So he's asked about focus groups. Has anyone in here participated in a focus group before? Okay, a few. All right. So a focus group, it reminds me of the car commercials you see lately, right? They bring in a group of, a dozen or so people into a room, and you're all sitting around, and someone comes in with a smile, like, we're going to have a conversation today. There are no wrong answers. We want to know how you feel, right? And essentially, a focus group is a little bit of a smaller, more in-depth version of the poll. What you're doing is you're testing out different messages. Maybe you're trying campaign ads. Let me show you this commercial. I'd like you to tell me your thoughts afterwards. It's very open-ended. And the moderator who's in there leading the discussion has to be very careful about their own bias and not transmitting it to people, right? And getting the natural reactions of what's working and what's not working. And it's another tool to discern public interest, right? That can be, it does not have to be, it is, my pollster friends are probably cringing that I suggested it's another way to do the poll. If you determine that women over 50 are the audience you want to target, your focus group may just be women over 50. Here's a commercial we created. Tell us what you think. What did you like? What did you not like? Here's another commercial we created, right? Here's a piece of mail. You're testing out very specific messages on a smaller group and extrapolating that out. It can be very, very helpful. The same way, I kind of relate it all back to how people learn in different ways, right? Some people like to read it, some people like to hear it, people need to do it. The same way I find with gathering information is like a poll is very dense in its numbers, and making those jumps, some people can do that really well. I'm with you. I like the results of a focus group, but it's a different tool. Part of the pollster's job, by the way, is to interpret the results for you. Yes, you get the crosstabs, which is this huge book of every possible different combination on every question so that you can know Catholics under 30 who live in Lawrence and, have a Bachelor of Arts think that Kermit the Frog is a trustworthy individual, right? But they'll put together a synopsis for you to interpret the results and tell you in layman's terms, here are the most effective messages. Here's what was not the most effective message. Here's the one that's going to sink your campaign, right? So if you know something is going to sink your campaign, get out in front of it, right? There's not a simple answer to that one, right? Like, there's no one answer, but if you know it's coming, I hope you do something about it. Other questions?
Could you talk a little bit about the intersection between the campaign and the pollster? Is it a fluid relationship where there's a lot of talking going back and forth, or is it you define your questions and then you give it to the pollster and you wait till they come back to you?
Sure. In really good pollsters, they're a member of your consultant team, and they're involved from the beginning of your campaign through the end. They're a member of your inner cabinet that you can trust and talk through ideas and ask questions about. So it is very much a full relationship where they're an integral part of your team. Now, there are certainly pollsters out there who are just like, yeah, you want to run a poll? We'll run a poll for you. Tell us what you want to say, right? But the good ones, the bigger campaigns, have people who are part of the team, because if you've run polls for 10 years across the country and you get to know, there are pollsters who know Kansas very well. There are pollsters who know Chicago very well, right? That experience is beneficial to understand the electorate and to understand the local differences. In the 3rd District, Johnson County has its own character and own history, right? As opposed to Wyandotte. And understanding the differences between those is pretty important, right? The same way that district is different from, going to the suburbs of Vegas, right? That is an entirely different populace, and the definition of Republican in Kansas is different than the local definition of Republican in Nevada, right? Maybe not on a conscious level, but in trends and data, they mean different things. Go ahead.
Sorry, thanks. So we know how polls can be helpful, particularly to campaigns, and aside from internal polls that are commissioned by campaigns for internal use only, I'm wondering about the danger of polls, particularly public polls. And so if you have a campaign that maybe shows your candidate with a comfortable lead, do campaigns get worried about that in terms of dampening voter turnout or
Sure.
and the negative effects of a positive poll, I guess?
Right. These I always like to call problems that are good to have, right? We're winning and we don't have a close race. Are we worried about people not showing up and thinking that we're going to coast to victory, right? It is absolutely a concern. I don't know that there's any statistical data that suggests or study that suggests that that's a valid concern, though, right? I will tell you, though, that in practice, the campaign doesn't let up. You're still running a get out the vote. If you're well above that margin of error and you know who to turn out, you're still going out to make certain nothing bad happens, right? Good campaigns will still spend a little bit, but not a lot of money talking to voters to reinforce the relationship, because anytime you have voters' attention, you want to take advantage of it to help reinforce and build your relationship with them. So it is a concern, but not an overwhelming concern. It's more often the opposite, right? You're the one losing, and the polls keep coming and saying you don't have a chance, and you're like, no, we do. I'm going to win this thing, right? Any other questions? Awesome. I want to thank you. Oh, yeah, one more. Yeah.
You mentioned that we're not typical, that most people aren't paying very much attention to the campaigns or to the candidates. Jimmy Kimmel sent somebody out on the street the other day to ask people if they approved of the appointment of Christopher Columbus to the Supreme Court, and they answered just as though, well, yes, So how much of this is ignorance that you're getting in the polls?
It's a great question. This is being recorded on the web, so I'm not going to answer. No. The answer is there's absolutely some. But if you do this right, it's consistent, so it will not affect the results. Does that make sense? If there's not enough, it's not like 30% of the people don't know what's going on, and you're asking questions to better understand who, making certain that the people you're asking questions of and understanding who they are, where they come from, what they are thinking, right? And if you're doing it consistently over time, and you have that problem, then you have a problem with your screen. You have a problem with who you're talking to, rather than a problem. Your poll should still be consistent in the results you're getting. You're like, oh, okay, 12% of these people don't know what they're talking about, but are giving me an answer, right? 6% of the people will say they've heard of Kelly Dietrich running for Congress. I mean, it's inherently part of the result of every poll. I don't know if that's helpful or depressing, as I think more about it. All right, I want to thank everybody for coming out. Thank you very, very much. Like I said, next week we're going to have some state party people here to talk about the future of state parties. Specifically, back in the day, state parties had patronage. They could give jobs, they could give money, they could do a lot of things. State parties have a very tough time now. How are they relevant? What can they do? We're going to talk through those questions and talk about it. And I'm excited as we'll have the Kansas Democratic Party here. Like I said, we're going to try to get some counterpoints, and so we can talk about some local races that may or may not be going on. Thank you, everybody. I hope I see you next week. Appreciate you coming out.